item on this committee.
The committee will come to order. Good afternoon. Today's markup is all about giving Americans more affordable health care choices. Americans should have the ability to save and spend their health care dollars the way they want and need. Unfortunately, this isn't the case for many families, thanks in part to flawed Obamacare policies and regulations. I've heard from countless individuals across my communities in Texas who've been stuck with dwindling options, rising costs, and fewer choices. That's why today's Ways and Means Committee markup is aimed at increasing access and lowering costs for Americans. We'll advance policies that expand health savings accounts and also allow for individuals to have an off-ramp from Obamacare's rising premiums by allowing more choice in financial assistance, both on and off government-sponsored exchanges. While these policies do not reverse the failures of Obamacare, they focus on modernizing and expanding access to consumer-directed plans tied to popular health savings accounts. These reforms will preserve the structural integrity of the consumer-directed approach, allowing them to continue offering lower premiums and bending the cost curve. Health savings accounts, as you know, are an important tool for families to set aside money that's tax-free to pay for needed health care expenses. This helps reduce the burden of high health care costs and enables families to plan ahead for events like the birth of a child. It's no wonder why so many families think health savings accounts are so great. They give choice and lower costs. That's what today is all about, choice. Americans should have a voice when it comes to their health care. That's why we continue to emphasize competition, innovation, and individual choice. The 11 bills before us today all look to do just that. A good example of how we're promoting competition and innovation, H.R. 6301, the Promoting a High-Value Health Care through Flexibility for High-Deductible Health Care Plans, Act of 2018. This bipartisan bill, sponsored by Health Subcommittee Chairman Roscom and Congressman Thompson, provides health plans with flexibility to offer smart, high-value health benefits without losing eligibility to make contributions to a health savings account. Examples of this include telehealth and primary care visits. This bill will enable more plans to qualify as HSAs, helping millions of Americans save for their health care costs and promoting smart health care decision-making. That's just one of a number of innovative bills we'll consider today. I want to thank all of our members for their hard work on the bills before us today. I now yield to the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Neal, for the purposes of an opening statement. Mr. Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The health and tax-related bills we are considering today would not address the health care challenge facing the American public. In fact, health savings accounts have long been components of Republican efforts to dismantle the ACA. The provisions we are considering today provide America's wealthiest with another option to stash tax-free money at a cost of $92 billion to taxpayers. Their idea of choice is to help the wealthy or the very wealthy. Most of the legislation does very little for the average American. Instead, we should be strengthening and protecting already existing health programs like the ACA, like Medicare, and like Medicaid, not slashing them. Consumers are already struggling to afford health care costs, including the cost of prescription drugs, and these bills do nothing to help them. If you cannot afford your monthly prescription, you're unlikely to have the money to fund an HSA. Actions today would not reverse the ongoing sabotage on our nation's health care system. The list is astounding. Proposed cuts to Medicare, proposed cuts to Medicaid, proposed cuts to CHIP, and rolling back consumer protections, zeroing out the individual mandate, and cutting off funds for risk adjustment. All this has led to increased premiums. It creates more uncertainty and discriminates against those, believe it or not, with pre-existing condition, singularly the most popular aspect of the ACA. I say again, pre-existing conditions. It is heartening to think of families that have to make these difficult decisions as they stand by and watch their plans sabotaged. Nearly 44% of the American family members cannot afford a $400 emergency. How then can Republicans expect to fund an HSA or pay for routine, needed care in one of these catastrophic plans. Last week, the Boston Globe reported about a woman who had her leg cut to the bone by a mishap at a train station. But when people came to her aid, she screamed out, and I quote, "Please, don't call an ambulance because I can't afford the bill," and she had insurance. 1 in 4 cancer patients reports that they are not able to fill a prescription or taking less medicine than prescribed due to cost. These measures would do nothing to help these people. They simply provide greater tax shelters for those with the means to take advantage of them. Instead of ensuring a sustainable future for the ACA, Medicare, Medicaid, Republicans want to cut these programs to pay for a $2.3 trillion tax plan, and today's bills add close to another $100 billion to the deficit. All this for programs that few Americans have the extra income to use in the first place. I want to be clear. HSAs do not provide a replacement for cost-sharing reduction and premium subsidies that help low and moderate income Americans, the very same subsidies that Republicans have been trying to undermine in the courts for the past decade. We have this legislation before us today. It will not solve problems facing average Americans. It leaves them and their families with increased health care costs, lower coverage, and diminished quality in their care. And I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Neal. Our first order of business is H.R. 6301 to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to provide high-deductible health plans with first dollar coverage flexibility. I recognize the bill sponsor, Mr. Roscom, Chairman of the Health Subcommittee, for purposes of an opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, I have a privileged motion. And
gentlemen will suspend. Let me look at the motion.
I'll pass it down in writing. I do. Okay. Mr. Chairman, pursuant to Clause 4A of House Rule 16, I would ask to be heard on the motion to postpone until Monday. You can't read my clear writing?
You and I have the same affliction, just so you know. Gentleman is recognized to make your point.
Thank you for your courtesy, Mr. Chairman. This motion simply requests that we have until Monday, July 16th, to learn from you whether or not you plan to pay the $92 billion price tag for this legislation, and if so, how. I understand that to some folks who've already voted to saddle the nation with trillions of dollars of debt, to borrow astronomical amounts from the Saudis and the Chinese, that another $92 billion is just a footnote in red ink, especially since some of the same folks want to add trillions more in additional tax breaks later this year. But I would ask you, in considering the motion, to give us just a few days to get the answers on this $92 billion and how it will be paid for, to consider that with $92 billion, you could fund for a year not 1, but 3 National Institutes of Health to address treatments and cures for dread diseases. You could finance the entire Department of Education budget, and instead of the DeVos approach of slash and burn public education over there, you could actually increase educational opportunity by about 50%. This motion asks only that we give you until Monday to answer the $92 billion question that's pending. And in these few days, perhaps we could also have some expert witnesses come to discuss whether spending $92 billion this way on health savings accounts is the best and most effective patch to put on our health care system to offer the most Americans a little more accessibility to health care. It would even give us an opportunity to send out a search party and see if we can find anyone in the Trump administration with the courage to come over and explain and answer questions about how this fulfills the promise that he made to, quote, offer everyone more and that coverage that costs less than what I think is the very successful Affordable Care Act up until the point that it began to be dismantled. Instead of just narrowly talking about health savings accounts, I think what we need to be doing now and better on Monday is to talk about saving health care accessibility from the repeated attacks that have been made under what I suppose you now have to call Trump care, which basically means not very much care or nothing care for many. I believe that this legislative package is less about HSA and more about CYA, but I would not use the kind of coarse language the President spouts. I think you can call it cover your tracks or CYT legislation for what has basically been an assault on health accessibility. HSAs are a device to cushion the fortunate from the harm done by Trump care. They do nothing to contain spiraling health care costs like prescription price drug gouging that has soared at 10 times the rate of inflation. And HSAs are basically not accessible to many of those who most desperately need health care coverage. We note from the data that has been collected for today's markup that only 5%, that is 5 out of 100 Americans who earn less than $100,000, even have a health savings account, with 70% of the value of HSAs coming from households making over $100,000. I would urge the committee to give us this very short period of time, which will not prevent your acting on this legislation, but will give us an opportunity to know who pays and how on this $92 billion, and hopefully to hear from someone in the administration about how this legislation fits into the overall Trump care agenda. And with that, I would move the adoption of the motion to give us until Monday to get these answers, and thank you for your courtesy.
Thank you, Mr. Doggett. There's no need to wait till Monday. The answer is no.
No to what part?
This reason, no to postponement, to consider the pay-fors for this bill, and here's why. So when Democrats passed Obamacare in the dead of the night, filled with special interest provisions, with not a single Republican of note supporting it, it had no remorse in slashing $700 billion from Medicare, no remorse in adding $1 trillion of tax cuts, and seemingly no remorse in promising every American will see a reduction of their health care costs of $2,500 a family. Remember those promises? Instead, every year, we've seen a double-digit increase, it seems, in Obamacare. Our constituents can see fewer doctors locally, go to fewer hospitals, they have fewer choices of plans, yet they have higher out-of-pocket costs, and now, on average, health care premiums have doubled for our American families under Obamacare than before. Today is about giving Americans more choice and freedom over their own tax dollars to try to lower the cost of health care for their families, to be able to afford preventable care in a way that's good for them, and to offer them freedom that, frankly, they don't have today. And to tell you the need for this, Mr. Doggett, more Americans who are required to get Obamacare and are given massive subsidies, more Americans have opted out of taking an affordable care plan. Many of them, 19 million, choosing to pay a penalty. Many of the middle-class families, rather than take a health care plan they don't want and can't afford. And so I am prepared to rule on the motion. The motion to postpone is denied.
On that, Mr. Chairman, I would respectfully request a record vote and understand your no to also indicate that there's no intention to pay for the $92 billion.
So I believe the member's parliamentary motion would be to appeal the ruling of the chair. Mr. Roscom?
I move to table the appeal.
Questions on the motion to table to appeal the chair's ruling. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion table is agreed to.
On that, Mr. Chair, I would.
Roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Nunes? Mr. Reichert? Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska? Mr. Smith, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black? Mr. Reed? Aye. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Kelly? Aye. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Renacci? Mr. Renacci, aye. Ms. Nome? Ms. Nome, aye. Mr. Holding? Mr. Holding, aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri? Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Rice? Mr. Rice, aye. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert, aye. Ms. Walorski? Ms. Walorski, aye. Mr. Curbelo? Mr. Curbelo, aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. LaHood? Mr. LaHood, aye. Dr. Winstrip? Dr. Winstrip, aye. Mr. Neal? Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Kind? Mr. Kind, no. Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley? Mr. Crowley, no. Dr. Davis? Dr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins, no. Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell, no. Ms. Del Bene? Ms. Del Bene, no. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu, no. Mr. Nunez? Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Black? Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Blumenauer? Chairman Brady?
Aye.
Chairman Brady, aye.
Yes, Ms. Blumenauer. How is Ms. Blumenauer recorded?
Mr. Blumenauer is not recorded.
How do you wish to be recorded? He's a big no.
Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Chairman.
Clerk will report the vote.
22 yeas, 16 nays.
There be 22 ayes and 16 noes. The motion to table the appeal is passed. So I believe we're on the first order of business for H.R. 6301, and I recognize the bill's original co-sponsor, the original sponsor, Mr. Roscom, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last month, the Health Subcommittee held a bipartisan hearing on health savings accounts, and in that hearing, witnesses discussed trends in enrollment demographics as well as the barriers employers and individuals face when trying to offer or enroll in an HSA-qualified plan. The members of the subcommittee heard from a variety of witnesses, including WageWorks, Inc., a company that provides administration for nearly 85,000 employers nationwide. We heard from WageWorks that the median household income for an HSA is different than what Mr. Ritchie characterized. The average household income for an HSA account holder is $57,000. They also reported that nearly 77% of participants contributing to an HSA were born in 1965 or after. So in other words, modest income, younger people. According to a recent survey of health insurers, over 21 million people were covered by a high-deductible health plan with an HSA as of January of 2017. It was clearly demonstrated that these types of plans continue to increase in popularity, and the demographic of HSA account holders, as I mentioned before, is really quite diverse. As the committee continues to discuss health care reform, we've got to remember that empowering individuals and their families to make decisions for themselves based on their needs and their own budgets is critical. As demonstrated by the witnesses at the subcommittee hearing, engaging customers in their health care spending can also help rein in our costs that are overtaking our system. One of the best tools to accomplish this goal is consumers-directed health plans that are paired with an HSA. So, H.R. 6301, which I'm pleased that I introduced with Mr. Thompson of California gives consumers the choice and flexibility they need to engage in their health care. The bill allows plans to offer coverage for high-value, low-cost services like telehealth, chronic disease management, such as diabetic testing strips or primary care visits below the deductible. Furthermore, by providing these options, consumers are incentivized to take control of their health and use services that reduce costs down the line. This legislation expands access and enhances the utility of an HSA while maintaining eligibility. And I'm pleased that this bipartisan bill is included in this markup, and I'd like to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership in helping to make this come to pass. I yield back.
Thank you, gentleman. Yields back. I now recognize the bill's original co-sponsor, Mr. Thompson, for purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Roscom, thank you for your partnership on this measure. And we've both worked on this for quite a while, and during the last month's hearing, I think we rightfully pointed out the problem with high deductible health plans and the health savings accounts that accompany them, and that this measure would plug a gap. It's an important plug. I do want to mention, however, that it is not the answer to the problems that the chairman mentioned in his rebuttal to Mr. Doggett. I think it's important that we pass these bipartisan measures to address some of the issues around the fringe of the health care debate, but the fact remains that you can't continue to sabotage the Affordable Care Act and then criticize it for having problems. Nor is it accurate to suggest, Mr. Chairman, that everybody was forced to buy, quote-unquote, Obamacare. You know well that's not what the bill did, and it ought to be pointed out that the other comment about destabilizing Medicare was absolutely inappropriate and incorrect. It actually added to the life of Medicare. So while we should do this, we shouldn't lose sight of the bigger, more important issue, and that's providing access to quality health care to the American people. I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, gentleman. Yields back. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 6301. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. This time, I offer an amendment in nature substitute, which was distributed in advance, along with the green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in nature substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I'll now turn to Tom Bartold, Staff Director for the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in nature substitute with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask the members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Bartold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, you have before you two joint committee documents, JCX 41 and JCX 42, which describe the underlying legislation, H.R. 6301, and the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. Since a number of the bills that you have before you today are related to health savings accounts, it may be important to give just a little bit of basic background applicable to all the bills. Health savings accounts are linked to high deductible health plans. An individual may establish a health savings account only if the individual is covered under a qualifying high deductible health plan. H.R. 6301 goes to the definition of what is a qualified high deductible health plan. Notwithstanding that deductible usually applies to first dollar payments for medical care, under present law, a high deductible health plan may provide coverage for certain preventive services, such as routine prenatal and well child care. H.R. 6301 expands on this notion by permitting up to $250 for a self-only plan, $500 for a family plan of other specified services. These amounts are indexed, and the proposal would be effective for plan years beginning after December 31st of 2018. That concludes my brief description. Be happy to discuss any details that the members might have.
Thank you, Mr. Bartold. Are there any questions about the amendment in nature substitute? Mr. Levin, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bartold, I have a document that talks about the distribution of the benefit, the tax benefit, based on joint tax committee data. I'd like to just review this with you and ask you to indicate whether it's accurate. The percentage of the tax expenditure value, income level 0 to 50,000, there's an asterisk, meaning essentially nothing or close to nothing. For 50 to 100,000, the percentage of the tax expenditure value, 18%. The percentage for those at an income level of 100,000 to 200,000, 27%. And the income level over 200,000 receive 54% of the tax expenditure value. Are those figures accurate?
Mr. Levin, I believe those figures are accurate. The table I have and that I believe that your staff may have worked with you is based on dollar values. We did not do I did not do percentages by income category. Perhaps it'll be helpful for today and tomorrow if I have later today delivered to all the members the specific table that you're looking at, if that would be appropriate. But doing the calculations in my head as you spoke, they seem accurate. Yes.
So there's a lot of talk here about who benefits. And I just think I asked you this question so that we could start off by talking about facts. I know it isn't always customary to do that, especially today, but I just think that everybody, before they consider this package of bills, should understand who the primary beneficiaries are. Do you have any figures on the percentage of income groups that participate in HSAs? That's a slightly different figure.
Data from 2015 indicates that there are approximately 88 million policies that are high deductible plans for which individuals or their employer may establish for that policy holder an HSA.
And do you have any data on the income levels of the people who, as a result, benefit?
Well, that would be consistent with the figures that you were citing earlier, Mr. Levin, in terms of some of the data I believe we reported to you and your staff were employee contributions to health savings accounts and HSA contributions by employers to health savings accounts. And we did provide a distributive breakdown of that by our traditional income classifier, and that's the material that I just promised that I'd deliver to all the members later today, this evening, or first thing.
Okay, so you'll make sure that we all have it?
You will all have that.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I ask that this table be, as soon as it's received, be placed in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Does anyone else wish to question Mr. Bartold about the amendment in nature of substitute? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are no amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in nature of substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. Being the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in nature of substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 6301 as amended to the House of Representatives.
Question is on favorably reporting the bill H.R. 6301 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 6301 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House. A roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Nunez? Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska? Mr. Smith, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black? Mr. Reed? Aye. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Renacci? Mr. Renacci, aye. Ms. Nome? Ms. Nome, aye. Mr. Holding? Mr. Holding, aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri? Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Rice? Mr. Rice, aye. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert, aye. Ms. Walorski? Ms. Walorski, aye. Mr. Curbelo? Mr. Curbelo, aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. LaHood? Mr. LaHood, aye. Dr. Winstrup? Dr. Winstrup, aye. Mr. Neal? Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson, aye. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind? Mr. Kind, aye. Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley? No. Mr. Crowley, no. Dr. Davis? Dr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins, no. Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell, no. Ms. Del Bene? Ms. Del Bene, no. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu, no. Ms. Jenkins, or Mr. Nunez? Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Black? Ms. Black, aye. Chairman Brady?
Aye.
Chairman Brady, aye. Mr. Chairman?
Clerk will report the vote.
24 yeas, 14 nays.
In this vote, the ayes are 24 and the noes are 14. The motion is agreed to. H.R. 6301 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, I ask the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill and that members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. Our next order of business is H.R. 6317 to amend the Internal Revenue Code of '86 to provide that direct primary care service arrangements do not disqualify deductible health savings account contributions and for other purposes. I'll now turn to Mr. Paulson, the bill's sponsor, to give an opening statement. Mr. Paulson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. I introduced the Primary Care Enhancement Act, H.R. 6317, with my colleague, Representative Blumenauer, to clarify 2 provisions and fix 2 provisions in the tax code that treat direct primary care, or these DPC arrangements, as health care plans rather than medical services, and that also currently prohibit individuals from using their own HSA funds to pay the doctor of their choice. Direct primary care is a very important consumer-driven health care delivery reform that is now reducing costs and improving access to primary care all across the country. The concept's very simple. Instead of paying a doctor a fee every time you need a procedure, you'll pay a monthly subscription and hire a doctor that you're going to keep you well. You can call, you can email, you can text, you can visit that doctor anytime you want, and you'll never get an additional bill or file a claim. Direct primary care gives the patient more time with the doctor. Doctor-patient relationship keeps it strong. It allows the doctor time to build that true relationship with their patients so that they can better understand and address their health needs. Today, direct primary care is providing high-quality care at lower costs for individuals of all ages and incomes across America. But if you happen to have one of these arrangements with the direct primary care physician, you are prohibited from using your health care savings account to pay that monthly fee because the IRS has interpreted it as a form of prohibited health insurance coverage. So here's an example of why we need this legislation. Dr. Julie Anderson is a family physician from Minnesota. She's a great doctor. She's a graduate from the University of Minnesota Medical School, and she wanted to spend more time with her patients and less time billing insurers, so she has to just started now with a new direct primary care practice called PrimaCare Direct. Now, they offer membership for a primary care that allows you to pay one low monthly fee of $75 directly for unlimited primary care access. She wants to now be able to grow this practice by offering her services to employers as part of their benefits package, but so many of them offer high deductible health plans with healthcare savings accounts. So right now, employees who have healthcare savings accounts can't get access to the high level of personal care that Dr. Anderson offers or other family physicians would offer, like same-day appointments, telemedicine consults by phone, text, or email, all without filing a claim or paying a bill. So the Primary Care Enhancement Act fixes all this. 25 states now, including the state of Oregon, have passed laws defining direct primary care as a medical service. Minnesota is also currently debating a bill to do the same. Health and Human Services rules now on essential health benefits clearly state that direct primary care arrangements are medical services and not health insurance, but the IRS is now the only regulator who sees this kind of care as a health plan. So the Primary Care Enhancement Act fixes this for more than 95% of employers that offer their employees a direct primary care model combined with an HSA. I want to thank my colleague, Representative Blumenauer, for his work also on this legislation and this idea in past years. I think we're glad that it's finally having a chance to be given a hearing and marked up today. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hopefully we'll be able to move this bipartisan bill onto the floor for a vote in the near future, and I yield back.
Thank you, gentleman. Yields back. I now recognize the bill's original co-sponsor, Mr. Blumenauer, for purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I strongly agree with what my friend Mr. Paulson has said about the legislation. I would begin by thanking the staff. This has been a vexing issue for me. I have been for years trying to explain to my physician at home in Portland why that this is somehow a health plan or insurance. We've gone through the ins and outs with the IRS and having Ways and Means staff from both sides of the aisle. Melanie, and I think more recently Allie, I have not worked with her, but I understand she's been wading in. The staff has really dealt trying to help unwrap this, and I think we've got a bill that ought to be included in something soon. Because there's controversies around some of the application of health savings accounts. There are a whole range of things that we can debate. But we ought not to debate the opportunity to be able to use direct primary care for a fixed annual or monthly fee to free physicians from the 8-minute segment of rotating people through the paperwork, a range of things that some physicians have just said, no, we want to do a different model. And the direct primary care model works. It's cost effective. It is better care, I will tell you. And the evidence is strong. This is a small, modest step. It's not going to break the bank, but it is going to add to the opportunities that people have. It's going to make direct primary care easier to realize its full potential. And we're going to be able to take a little tiny bipartisan step to make a difference that is the sort of thing that I would hope we'd be able to do more of when it comes to health care, taking the things that make sense. I must, Mr. Chairman, as I close, request permission to add into the record a statement about another thing that would make a big difference for our health, and that is if we would assume our responsibilities as a committee to deal with infrastructure finance. Inadequate infrastructure hurts Americans' health every day. Sewer, water, brown fields that haven't been cleaned up, unnecessary air pollution, accidents on our highways. And if our committee would accept its responsibility to help America fund our transportation infrastructure, we've only had one 5-minute witness in 396 hearings that we've had. I think we could find another area of bipartisan cooperation that would make a difference for America's health, our economy, and something we could feel good about. But in the meantime, I'm going to feel good about this bill if we're able to maybe move something forward. But I would ask unanimous consent to enter that statement into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Blumenauer. We'll now proceed to consideration of H.R. 6317. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. This time, I offer an amendment in nature substitute, which was distributed in advance, along with the green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in nature substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I'll now turn to Tom Bartold, Staff Director for the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in nature substitute with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Bartold, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, you have before you two joint committee documents, JCX 43 and JCX 44, which describe the underlying legislation and the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. As noted previously, a taxpayer can establish a health savings account if covered by a qualifying high-deductible plan and no other health plan. Direct primary service arrangements are considered disqualifying for this purpose, and H.R. 6317, as amended by the chairman's amendment, would provide that direct primary care arrangements would not disqualify a taxpayer from having a health savings account. For this purpose, a direct primary care arrangement cannot have a cost of more than $150 per month for single coverage, $300 for family coverage. These amounts are indexed for inflation. And in addition, the chairman's amendment provides the short title to the legislation of the Primary Care Enhancement Act of 2018. That concludes my brief description of this legislation. Happy to answer any questions that the members might have.
Thank you, Mr. Barthold. Are there any questions about the amendment in the nature of substitute? Mr. Kind.
Mr. Barthold, I'm just trying to get a CBO cost number. I'm looking at 1.8 billion over 10. Does that sound right?
Yes, Mr. Kind. I should have noted that on each of the green sheets, my colleagues have provided the estimated budgetary effects of the legislation, and for the chairman's amendment, the cost relative to the present law baseline across the 10-year budget period would be a revenue loss of $1.8 billion.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions about the amendment in nature of substitute? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Are there any amendments to the amendment in nature of substitute? If there are no amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in nature of substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. 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 Those opposed, no. No. Opinion chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in nature of substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 6317 as amended to the House of Representatives.
Question is on favorably reporting the bill. H.R. 6317 is amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 6317 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House. A roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Nunez? Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska? Mr. Smith, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black? Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Renacci? Mr. Renacci, aye. Ms. Nome? Ms. Nome, aye. Mr. Holding? Mr. Holding, aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri? Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Rice? Mr. Rice, aye. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert, aye. Ms. Walorski? Ms. Walorski, aye. Mr. Curbelo? Mr. Curbelo, aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. LaHood? Mr. LaHood, aye. Dr. Winstrup? Dr. Winstrup, aye. Mr. Neal? Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, aye. Mr. Kind? Mr. Kind, aye. Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley?
No.
Mr. Crowley, no. Dr. Davis? Dr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins, no. Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell, yes. Ms. Delbene? Ms. Delbene, aye. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu, no. Mr. Nunez? Ms. Jenkins? Chairman Brady?
Aye.
Chairman Brady, aye. Chairman Brady?
The clerk will call the roll.
26 yeas, 12 nays.
On this vote, the ayes are 26, the noes are 12. The motion is agreed to. H.R. 6317 is amended, ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives without objection. Ask the staff be authorized to make technical conforming changes to the bill. The members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. Our next order of business is H.R. 6305, the Bipartisan HSA Improvement Act of 2018. I turn to the bill's sponsor, Mr. Kelly, for purposes of an opening statement. Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for including H.R. 6305, the Bipartisan HSA Improvement Act of 2018, in today's markup. This important legislation expands access to and enhances the utility of health savings accounts, also known as HSAs. H.R. 6305 gives employers more flexibility to offer quality health care in the setting that's best for them, like on-site or retail clinics. Employers around the country are offering innovative ways to deliver health care to their associates, and this provision makes sure that individuals with HSAs can utilize these same services. Second, it fixes the HSA spouse penalty by allowing individuals to make HSA contributions if a spouse has a flexible spending account, while preventing double dipping in tax benefits. Lastly, it makes it easier for people to save for their health care by streamlining the conversion of other tax-preferred accounts to HSAs. Ultimately, this bill modernizes health care delivery and gives employers the freedom to innovate and improve their employees' health. We are trying to improve health care for all Americans. This means giving consumers a choice in their health care. This means incentivizing wellness and exercise, not sickness. This means giving employers the freedom to design insurance products that work best for their associates. I also want to thank my friend Earl Blumenauer for working on this together. This issue is extremely important for the 175 million Americans who get their health insurance from their employer. And therefore, I hope we can get this common sense legislation signed into law very soon. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. I'll now turn to Mr. Blumenauer, original co-sponsor of the bill, for purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is, I think, an important addition to the employer-provided insurance programs. We here in the House of Representatives have access to nursing stations where people can access health care on the job. I mean, a lot of people are trapped in these buildings 24/7, and having access to care in the workplace makes it more likely that people will get it when they need it, less disruption to schedule, actually being able to integrate it into terms of how they work. Being able to do this is actually more cost effectively. And another provision in this bill would enable people to be able, when they switch jobs, to be able to continue, not forfeit the resources. And I think that's important as well. I think these are common sense. I hope ultimately they're enacted into law. I'm pleased to work with my friend Mr. Kelly as we try and massage this and move it forward. The other bill that we had was minimally expensive. I mean, $1 billion counts, but this bill is pushing $5 billion, and we're talking cumulatively here about a number of bills that have merit, but the collective impact of them pretty expensive. Now, this one, I think, doesn't need to be involved in the debate over HSAs and whatnot. This is recognizing what we have now. But I know our friend Mr. Kind has been vigilant on this in the past, and I am hopeful, as this works its way through the process, that we can work together to find ways to offset the costs here, and particularly when we're talking about something here that's almost $5 billion. But I'm pleased to work with my friend and hope we can move it along through the process and ultimately be able to take advantage of the benefit.
Thank you, Mr. Blumenauer. We'll now proceed to consideration of H.R. 6305. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. At this time, I offer an amendment in nature of substitute, which was distributed in advance along with the green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I'll now turn to Tom Bartold, Staff Director for the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask the members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Bartold, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, you have before you two joint committee documents, JCX 45 and 46, which describe the underlying legislation and the chairman's amendment, the nature of a substitute. The legislation before you has three primary components. First, it expands from on-site clinical services as qualifying services under high deductible plans to off-site retail clinical services, and in addition makes some changes in terms of the expansion of permitted services that may be provided both on-site and off-site. Second, the proposal makes makes a taxpayer eligible to contribute to a health savings account without regard to the spouse's status holding a health flexible spending account. And lastly, the proposal provides that if a taxpayer has amounts in a health flexible spending account, a health reimbursement arrangement, and has them distributed to a health savings account in connection with that taxpayer establishing a high deductible health plan, that that the distributions may count as contributions to the health savings account, notwithstanding that it occurs mid-year relative to establishing, to enrolling in the high deductible health plan. In each case, these provisions are generally effective for plan years, tax years, or distributions after December 31st of 2018. That concludes my brief description of this legislation. Happy to answer any questions that the members might have.
Thank you, Mr. Barthold. Are any questions about the amendment? Nature of substitute, Mr. Doggett.
Mr. Barthold, is there any, in this bill, does it contain any way to finance the cost of it?
If you're referring to the estimated revenue effect, there were no specific provisions in the legislation that we identified as revenue-raising provisions.
And so how much does it cost?
Approximately $4.3 billion over the 10-year.
$4.3 billion. There's nothing in the bill that will pay for that. That will be an offset.
That it is a net revenue loss over the 10-year period, Mr.
Thank
Doggett.
you.
Thank you. Are there any questions, other questions about the amendment in the nature of substitute? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Mr. Doggett, you recognize strike the last word.
Mr. Chairman, while I guess hope does spring eternal, and I certainly respect the decisions of colleagues that they support these measures and are hopeful that an offset will be found to cover the tremendous cost involved, the total of $92 billion. I think I interpret your firm no on my motion to be an indication that since the Republicans abandoned the pay-go principles in the House rules, that there's absolutely no intention at all to have an offset or even to initiate a search for an offset. And if there is any willingness to finance any of these provisions, this bill or any of the other legislation, by seeing that they're paid for rather than simply adding to the debt, the trillions of dollars of debt that this committee and the House majority have already burdened our country with one economic study after another from leading investment banks and academics saying that this will have the effect of slowing economic growth in the country as these trillions of dollars of debt slow our economy. To add another $92 billion is a serious economic flaw, especially when it does so little for people who are covered here. I remember seeing a study not very long ago that nearly a third of Americans say that if they were faced with a crisis in their family that cost as little as $400, that they could not afford that amount. How many of those people, almost half of Americans, do you think are going to create a health savings account in the current form or in any of the forms that are reflected in this bill? No, this legislation, the ultimate effect of it is to borrow $92 billion, add to the national debt, and only have the effect through this device and through many others that are throughout our tax code of simply widening an already great economic gap in this country, great income inequality, where those who are fortunate can use devices like this. And I applaud the efforts of my colleagues to try to find any way to upgrade the life preserver that is out there for people concerned about health care cost and their accessibility to health care when the Trump administration is doing everything it possibly can to destroy the rights under the Affordable Care Act, particularly for those who have a pre-existing condition, like almost half of the Texans that I represent have. Those people are going to be profoundly impacted by Trump Care, by the attack on affordability and accessibility of health care. But doing it this way, when those most in need will not be able to advantage themselves of any of the bills that are being considered today, when those bills will only widen the income inequality that is far too high in our country today, and on top of that, to throw in another $92 billion of debt when we know that the advocates of this legislation are already planning, though they're holding it to election season for maximum political advantage, to add another couple of $1 trillion to the debt. these are going to have far-reaching consequences on our economy. They will hurt people at all income levels, but they will most severely and directly affect those who are in need of accessibility to health care and who are out there struggling to make ends meet now. The very people that say they couldn't handle a $400 crisis in their family, that almost half of Americans, those are the folks that will be called on to pay off this debt and future generations at the same time they find themselves unable to access the health care that their families need. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone else wish to strike the last word? Mr. Kind, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barthel, just to be clear, this bill would entail a $4.3 billion 10-year cost. Is that correct?
That's correct, Mr. Kind.
Okay. Well, Mr. Chairman, I commend Mr. Blumenauer and Mr. Kelly for trying to work in a bipartisan fashion on policy to try to fix something that is in need of fix. But I want to echo the sentiments that Mr. Blumenauer and Mr. Doggett just made about the need for this committee, especially, to try to find a way to move forward in a fiscally responsible manner. You know, the cost of these individual bills may not be that significant in the grand federal pie, but it does add up. And my concern is that any sense of fiscal discipline is completely gone out the window in this Congress. And that is not appropriate for future generations, nor is it appropriate for when the next business cycle turns down on us. We are giving away every fiscal tool that we have available in order to counteract a deep recession or worse, a Great Depression in this country. From the passage of the tax cut last year, that's going to add over $2 trillion plus in national debt over the next 10 years, to the 2-year budget agreement, that's another at least $500 million increase in the deficit, to the action we're taking today with a number of bills. And my name's on a couple of these bills coming up. But the total price of $92 billion plus, with no real effort to find an offset to pay for it, I think ties our hands in a future crisis, which unfortunately might be just around the corner, given the economic policies being pursued by this administration and by declaring a trade war against the rest of the world. There will be consequences to this with no end in sight. One of the hardest things that we had to do, and I know you appreciate it, Mr. Chairman, at the time because you were very critical of it, was making sure that we fully paid for and offset the Affordable Care Act before it was enacted into law. And that required tough trade-offs, tough decisions being made, but it was the fiscally responsible thing to do at the time and still is today. But because of policies being pursued by this Republican majority, the Medicare Trust Fund years were just rolled back 3 years with the latest trustee report because of the drop in revenue that was a result of the tax cut that was recently enacted. Because you slipped in the 11th hour the individual responsibility provision that was part of the Affordable Care Act. The Medicare Trust Fund now is 3 years closer to insolvency because of that. And the more we pile up the debt today means that solvency is going to hit us quicker tomorrow, with 10,000 baby boomers retiring every single day and joining Medicare and Social Security. We are doing nothing as a Congress to prepare for that demographic time bomb that's literally going off as we speak today. And that's very problematic and very dangerous. So I would hope that by the time these bills pass here at the committee, by the time it reaches the floor, that we get together and try to find reasonable bipartisan offsets to pay for this. And I'm also hearing rumors that this isn't going to be the end of it. There's talk about bringing permanent repeal of the medical device tax, which would be another $30 billion plus cost over 10 years, and possible extension of the Cadillac tax, which would be another $15 billion. We're looking at $150 billion right out of the block, if that's the intent of the majority in moving forward. Again, very dangerous fiscal policy being pursued right now. And what will happen during the next downturn is, since we ran out of any fiscal tools to counteract it, we're going to force the Fed into taking extraordinary measures again, like they had to just 8 short years ago, that no one liked around here and was widely decried, but it will be the only policy option left in this country because of what is taking place over the last couple of years. So I would hope that in the spirit of the bipartisan effort that we're making to try to get the policy right, that we make an equally hard effort doing this in a fiscally responsible manner, finding some reasonable bipartisan offsets to pay for this, before we dig the hole even deeper. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Chu, you're recognized to strike the last word.
Mr. Chair, I join my colleagues in saying that I am deeply concerned that today we will mark up 11 bills totaling $92 billion in cost with no offset. Let me say that again, $92 billion. What's more, we're spending this $92 billion to further attack the Affordable Care Act. So I cannot support this legislation under consideration in this markup because it undermines protections for people with pre-existing conditions and destabilizes the healthcare markets. We know that this money doesn't come out of thin air. At some point, the bill will come due, and that is when Republicans will start arguing that we do not have enough money to sustain Medicare, that we have to make cuts to Medicaid, that we need to cut the Social Security that our seniors have earned. Now, Speaker Ryan said that he's been dreaming of cutting Medicaid since back in his college days, and we know that this is the Republican goal because the budget they released just last month takes an axe to both Medicare and Medicaid in an attempt to balance the budget. In fact, it would cut $537 billion from Medicare and $1.5 trillion from Medicaid. Even Social Security sees a cut at $4 billion. And this is all after passing a $1 trillion tax plan with no offset. So at some point, the American people will be asked to pay. Let's not forget what happened the last time the ACA was attacked and the safety net was threatened. Let's not forget the activists dragged from their wheelchairs after protesting cuts to Medicaid during the Republicans' last attempt to repeal the Affordable Care Act. We should be spending this $92 billion to enact important changes that will improve the health care of average Americans, like expanding Medicaid, increasing mental health services for our veterans, and addressing the opioid crisis. Just a few weeks ago, the committee passed a package of bills to address the opioid epidemic. I participated in the makeup in this particular markup because, like many other members, this crisis has impacted my constituents and my community, and I hoped to see Congress work on solutions. But even there, Republicans refused to consider any bills that required significant funding. Yet today, we're considering $92 billion that would provide funding for this, but actually could provide funding for expanding treatment, increasing the number of mental health providers like psychologists, and setting up support services for those in recovery. I don't believe the ACA sabotaging proposals we're considering today are worthy of the use of taxpayer dollars. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
Lady yields back. Someone else wish to strike the last word? Mr. Lewis, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Sir.
I think it's unfair. It's not even decent to spend $92 billion to rob the poor, to rob our children of an education. It's not real. It's unbelievable. I think we can do much better. History will not be kind to us as a committee, will not be kind to us as a nation and as a people. We continue to go down this dark road. We have the power, we have the ability, we have the capacity to do much better. I think we can do much better, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Levin, you're recognized to strike the last word.
Mr. Chairman, now that the overall issue has been raised, I think we need to talk a little more about it. This is unpaid for. It's unpardonable. If we ask you now, are you going to guarantee before this comes to the floor, if it does, that it will be paid for? I'll ask you that. Will you guarantee that this will be paid for?
Does the gentleman yield?
Yes.
The answer is no.
Did everybody hear that?
I can repeat it if you'd like.
I think you should. And I think the public needs to hear that. And so $92 billion unpaid for. Fortunately, it won't go through the Senate in all likelihood. So that kind of rips the mask off what the majority is doing here. This is an effort to cover political positions. Secondly, there's a lot of talk here about Medicare. As mentioned by my colleagues, the bills you passed essentially has really further undermined the trust fund. And I want to say a last word about choices. You say this bill, and don't take them separately. There might be an argument for each of these separately. Together, there is not. These bills together undermine choice. They undermine the choice of ACA for millions of people. So I just want to review what the impact has been of the administration's positions. Last month, the Trump Justice Department argued that protections for Americans with pre-existing conditions should be eliminated, allowing insurers to discriminate against them. This is contrary to the law and threatens access to affordable coverage for more than 130 million. The President has also terminated payments for cost-sharing reductions for Americans earning between 100% and 250% of the property level. And you talk about these bills expanding choice. CBO estimates that this action alone was responsible for a 10% increase in Silver Plan premiums in 2018, and there's never been a hearing on this. The administration also announced earlier this year it would loosen restrictions on association health plans and short-term plans that are not subject to important consumer protections. This will increase protections. The Republican tax bill considered by the committee last year gutted the Affordable Care Act's individual responsibility requirement. Former HHS Secretary Price put it best when he said that this action, in quotes, will harm the pool in the exchange market because you will likely have individuals who are younger and consequent and healthier not participating in that market. And consequently, that drives up the cost for other folks in the market. And last fall, the Trump administration announced cuts of 90% to the Affordable Care Advertising Act and 40% to navigator organizations. This created substantial confusion for consumers just before the open enrollment period. And I want to close with this. Yesterday, the administration announced additional cuts of more than 70% for these efforts, navigator organizations. 70%. And I've worked with them. These are nonprofit organizations that reached out to people to help them understand availability of health insurance. And you talk about these bills creating more choice, you are rampant with your inability to face up to facts and essentially promote fiction. And when you put all these bills together, it is a dangerous fiction unpaid for without any intention to pay for them. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone else wish to strike the last word? Mr. Higgins, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. These 11 bills, as has been said, deal with health savings accounts costing $92 billion with no offset. That will add to the $1.84 trillion over a decade that my colleagues voted for in a corporate tax cut. These health savings accounts bills are a thinly disguised scam to take billions from the Medicare program to fund these tax cuts. The health savings accounts, granted, help people regardless of the cost of health care, which is too much, and the quality of health care, which is not nearly enough, versus the Affordable Care Act that deals fundamentally with the issue of both cost and quality, driving down cost and driving up the quality. Medicare is paid for by working Americans so that they have quality health care in their retirement years. The Affordable Care Act added 12 years to the Medicare Trust Fund, Solvency. Actions by my Republican colleagues took 3 years away from that and attempted to take another 3 years away. When the Medicare Trust Fund is rated, higher premiums and higher deductibles are the result, which hurts working families from which this program was designed to help. There was a June 9th, 2018 Wall Street Journal NBC poll which found that 22% of the respondents said that the most important issue this year, ahead of the economy, ahead of guns, ahead of taxes, ahead of immigration, was the issue of affordable quality health care. I would submit, Mr. Chairman, that these bills do nothing to address the issue of both cost and quality. With that, I'll yield back.
Chairman yields back. Ms. Dobeni, you recognize to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, our committee is considering several bills to expand and improve health savings accounts. And I appreciate the Chairman's willingness to move a handful of bipartisan bills, but we should not be fooled with what we're doing here today. While I agree that some of the changes that today's bills will make, with some of those changes that today's bills will make, health savings accounts are not the silver bullet to solving the problems in our healthcare system. It's important to point out that Kaiser Family Foundation's most recent survey of employers found that only 17% of employers offered HSA-qualified high-deductible health plans. I think it's even more telling that the low percentage is actually a 7% decrease from the prior year, indicating that employers are in fact moving away from the HSA model, not embracing it. While considering today's legislation, we should also consider who benefits. Only 5% of households earning $100,000 or less have an HSA. There's no question that today's bills do not help those with the most need. Also, today's bills do nothing to address rising premiums. My home state of Washington is facing a proposed rate hike on the individual market of 19%. And this didn't happen by accident. In fact, the CBO projects that the Republican tax bill zeroing out of the individual mandate is responsible for increasing premiums by 10%. And the administration has taken several steps to continue to sabotage the ACA. The administration has further wounded the already fragile individual market by allowing association health plans, which will raise premiums for those who are sicker and could lead to pricing out of individuals with pre-existing conditions, effectively bringing back a world where those with pre-existing conditions will be denied coverage. But before that, the administration eliminated cost-sharing reduction payments, which helped the lowest income ACA customers pay for their copays and deductibles. The CBO projected that eliminating the cost-sharing reduction payments would raise premiums by 20%. And now the administration has refused to defend the ACA in court. I would like to remind my colleagues that if the ACA is brought down in court, the protections for pre-existing conditions could be brought down as well. So, colleagues, these are the issues that this committee should be focused on: stopping policies that are raising premiums and protecting folks with pre-existing conditions who would be at risk again of being denied coverage. I know that more than 300,000 people in my district live with a pre-existing condition, including 40,000 children. And I wish that this was what this committee was working on today. Again, I remind my colleagues that today's bills do nothing to lower premiums and nothing to protect those with pre-existing conditions. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Would the gentlelady yield on that point? Would you yield right behind you? Susan?
Yes, I yield.
Thank you. I think the gentlelady makes a very important point. You know, Mr. Chairman, I know we get into this trap of going back and relitigating and redebating the ACA all over again, but the policy objective of undermining the ACA, which this Congress and the administration is fond of doing, ironically is actually increasing the overall fiscal costs. Because by suspending the cost-sharing reduction, now the risk adjustment payments, by eliminating the individual mandate, the prices in the health insurance exchanges are going up. And the premium tax credits are actually pegged to the overall cost of the plans. So the more you try to undermine it, the more the premiums increase, the cost of these plans go up, the greater the tax credit is going to attach, since 80% of the individuals going into the health insurance exchanges are qualifying for premium tax credits. It makes no sense from a fiscal point of view of what the administration and what this Republican Congress is trying to do to undermine the marketplaces. And that's unfortunate. Just last week I was home, and a middle-aged white male came up to me and told me that last year he was diagnosed with throat and chin cancer. And he said, but for the Affordable Care Act, chances are he wouldn't have gone in for treatment and he would be dead today. That's what he said to me. He'd be dead today. So this idea that the Affordable Care Act got it all wrong is fallacious. If you guys have a better plan, then we're interested in hearing it. But wait, you did last year. Unfortunately, the American people rejected it wholeheartedly. It would have cost 25 million Americans their health insurance, and you would have lavished $800 billion worth of tax cuts on the drug insurance companies. After 10 years, that was the best you could come up with an alternative. So I think we need to move beyond that debate and start fixing what isn't working. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Someone else wish to strike the last word? Recognize myself briefly. I'll point out, I appreciate the concerns on the deficits, and we share them. I think where we can, we ought to be looking to find pay-fors on these good policies. But it's a pleasant surprise to see Democrats talking about the deficits. Since you and President Obama added $2 trillion to the national debt in 1 year. 1 year added $2 trillion to American national debt. And today you're lecturing us? So, and what did that $2 trillion give us? The worst economic recovery since World War II, jobs going overseas, stagnant paychecks, Americans giving up hope. And we got an Obamacare, an affordable care program that has doubled the premiums for Americans forced into it. They no longer can see local doctors or go to local hospitals. Some of them have no choice. It's a take it or leave it proposition. Mr. Higgins is right. 5 years after Obamacare passed, health care is still the #1 priority. Remember, the Affordable Care Act that was supposed to solve health care in America has made it worse. Obamacare has been sabotaged by the Democrats who wrote it in secret, without Republican support or input, double counting its costs. And today, most Americans, frankly, feel worse off under Obamacare than before. And I can tell you this, I have many constituents who say I had a much better plan at work to cover me and my family than I do now under a plan I don't want and can't afford. So today, instead of Washington knows best, this is a family knows best. And what are we allowing people to do with their own money? Go see a primary care physician and get primary care directly available to them. Have the chance to do telehealth if they live in a rural community. Have the opportunity to go see an on-site clinic at work without being disqualified from saving. Allowing people to use their own dollars to lower their costs at a time where costs continue to skyrocket, despite the promises of the Affordable Care Act. So at the end of the day, these small packages of bills, many of them bipartisan, is about giving Americans the opportunity to use their dollars to be able to lower costs for what's right for them rather than Washington. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman,
gentlemen wish to strike the last word?
Would I like to strike the last word?
Mr. Neal, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, you used the term that it was a secret markup of the Affordable Care Act. Is it the Republican position that you folks weren't there for the markup?
Gentleman yield. I didn't say it was a markup.
You said it was
secret.
secret.
I said it was
you said
written
it was a secret
in secret.
get-together. It was done just like this in full public view.
Was,
the cameras were on.
Oh, does the gentleman now, just to correct the record, I think Ms. Pelosi, as Speaker, promised television cameras would be on. when this was written, and in fact, it was written in secret.
Oh, come on.
And passed through the
Can I take back my time,
reconciliation
Mr. Chairman?
process.
Mr. Chairman, the bill was not written in secret. There were 20 million more Americans who had health care after the ACA passed, and today it's down to 17 million, and that's because of the effort of the majority here to continue to sabotage the marketplace.
Will the gentleman yield on that point, Richie?
Yes, I would.
Just a quick point. If this was done in such secrecy, then why were 237 Republican amendments adopted to the Affordable Care Act?
No Republican amendments were offered by any Republicans to the Affordable Care Act. In fact, in this committee, Democrats rejected every Republican amendment offered. Correct?
Come on.
237
No.
Republican amendments.
Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Neal, do you yield back?
It depends on whether we're going to recognize Mr. Pascal.
I am going to recognize Mr. Pascal. Strike the last word.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Pascal.
Mr. Chairman, two things. A, B. A, this president took over and he said, "What a mess I inherited." I remember his words on the day. I don't know what the heck he would have done in January of 2009 with that mess, because of that budget that you talked about and referred, we're still on A, you referred to. There was no capitalizing, there was no investment, and if the federal government didn't get involved, as they have in every economic downturn in the 20th century and the 21st century, God knows where we would be. Now, let me give you a little history, Mr. Chairman. Inauguration Day 2017, President Trump issued an executive order that directed the agencies to undermine the ACA. You want me to read it to you? 2, January 2017. Trump's HHS department cut millions of dollars in outreach, customer assistance, total enrollment time. Let's put this all on a record. It's the record. You can't make this stuff up, you know. HHS used taxpayer dollars intended for advertising vital ACA enrollment information to fund an ad campaign intended to undermine the ACA. They did the same thing yesterday. May 2017, House passed the AHCA, which would have left 23 million more uninsured over the next 10 years. This is painful here, isn't it? Remove protections for those with pre-existing conditions, implement an age tax, and discrimination against women, increased 2018 premiums by 20% and gut Medicaid with $800 billion in cuts. We have very short memories. September 2017, HHS threatens states with decreased funding for pursuing policies that would lower premiums. Get you. Cut any investment, any research into lowering premiums. Some predicted by as high as 30%. Then on October 2017, the Trump administration announced they were canceling cost-sharing reduction payments. Remember that? The CSRs. Remember that, Mr. Chairman? You smiled about that. What did it do? The CBO projected would leave 1 million more uninsured. It would raise premiums 20 to 25% over the next 2 years and increase the deficit by $200 billion. A mere pittance compared to $2.3 trillion. I understand that. December 2017, the Republican tax bill, remember that, Mr. Chairman? The Republican tax bill added $2.3 trillion to the deficit, cut 3 years off the life of Medicare trust fund, short memories, and also zeroed out the individual mandate. The latter is predicted will lead to millions more uninsured and 15% premium increases. That was in December of 2017. 2018 of June. We're getting close. Don't worry, I'll be done soon. The Trump administration directed the Department of Justice not to defend the constitutionality of the consumer protections in the ACA. Think about that. We're working at cross purposes. We're not working together. You know, problem solvers? You got to be kidding me. Come together with the other side? Let me read that sentence again, Mr. Chairman. Maybe it hasn't sunk in. The administration directed the Department of Justice, remember those guys? Not to defend the constitutionality of the consumer protections of the ACA. Don't protect the consumer. We're going to rot this thing out even if we can't repeal it. Their legal argument, which has been denounced by liberal and conservative scholars, would gut protections that ensure that more than 130 million Americans with pre-existing conditions are not denied or charged exponentially more for coverage. On June 2018 also, the administration continued their streak of encouraging enrollment in junk plans. Sound familiar? When they finalized a rule to expand access to association health plans. I feel good doing this. I really do.
I know. Gentleman's time
I'm not
is expired.
finished.
I know, but your
Can
time
I get
is
somebody else's
expired.
time?
The gentleman's time is expired. Does anyone wish to
Chairman, I move to strike the last
strike
word.
the last word? Mr. Thompson, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield my time to Mr. Pescrell.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. From California, you're doing a great job. AHPs and short-term limited duration insurance don't have to cover essential benefits for older people or outright reject coverage. I know this is painful. It should be. Expanding use of these plans will lead to millions leaving the individual market, leaving a sicker risk pool and raising premiums. And then also in July, this month, the Trump administration announced they will not make $10.4 billion in risk adjustment payments, which ensure insurance companies don't cherry pick. You know what that means? You know what that means to premiums. When you cherry pick, you know what it does to the risk market. I'm not teaching you anything. You know what I'm talking about. And try to enroll only healthy populations. What a great plan that is. Only enroll the healthy in insurance plans. There is not one person in this room who doesn't know what the consequences of that are. That is. The administration stopped these payments at a time when insurance were determining their participation in rates for 2019. How convenient. So the rates are going to go up just before the election? Oh, I see. I'm beginning to understand this. July 2019. Your department, the administration's department of HHS, cut outreach and consumer education funding to local organizations by $10 million. You really twisted it, didn't you? And what you do when you're twisting it is trying to sap every drop of blood out of the ACA. You know how many bills we came up, how many amendments we had since 2010 to try to change this and make it better? You never were with us on any of them. The amendments we've come up with here, you're never with us on anything. So what is this kumbaya? We're going to all get together. We're all going to have a nice time. We're going to listen to you. You're going to listen to us. And then we'll come up with a resolution. Well, that's what reasonable people do. That's what reasonable people do. How dare you sit there and blame us for the mess that you caused? And we're willing to say, okay, bygones be bygones. Let's have a resolution. Let's have a solution. That's the fair thing to do. That's the American way to do. Because if you don't, and we don't, then a lot of people are going to suffer. Not just with preconditions either. Not just with preconditions. Mr. Chairman, you are, I consider, a pretty reasonable guy. But you've blown this. You really did. There is no reasonable way. If you look at the facts, I didn't make this stuff up. I didn't pick it off the shelf. When you take a look at the record. So when Mr. Trump came into office in January of last year, 2017, when he said, what a mess I inherited. That is so much malarkey and baloney, it isn't funny. I would have wanted him to be back. I hope he could go back in history, put him in charge in January of 2009. God save the Queen. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Rice,
Chairman,
you're recognized to strike the last word.
let's talk about phony and malarkey. Remember, you can keep your doctor. You remember, you can keep your policy. Do you remember that this is going to save the average family $2,500 a year? You want to talk about phony and malarkey? Oh my God. Actually, you know, the statement that Obamacare would save the average family $2,500 a year, that had to either be just an outright falsehood or just complete lack of knowledge about what was in the bill. To think that applying a health care tax, to think that applying a tax on health insurance companies, to think that applying a tax on pharmaceutical companies, to think that applying a tax on medical devices would drive down the cost of health care, who in their right mind with any common sense would think that any of those things would do anything but drive up the cost of health care? And in fact, you know, it played out exactly as Republicans said it would. I wasn't here then, but it played out exactly as they said it would. In the first 3 years, you know, the Democrats and Barack Obama were smart to say that delay the inception until after the president's second inauguration, because they knew if it went into effect beforehand and people actually got to see it, he wouldn't get reelected. And so it went into effect in 2014. In the first 3 years, before President Trump ever took office, the premiums, instead of going down by $2,500 per family, went up 107% in 3 years. The premiums went up 107%. Now let's think about that. What did we get with the Affordable Care Act? The object was we have these group of uninsured people, right? Well, let's talk facts. 85% of Americans were covered before the Affordable Care Act. Between private insurance, employer-provided, and individual insurance, between Medicaid and Medicare, 85% of Americans were covered. This was before the quote-unquote protections of the Affordable Care Act. Now, Mr. Pascrell said a minute ago, if we did away with these protections of the Affordable Care Act, 137 million Americans would lose their coverage. That would be over like 40% of the population. Well, they were covered before the Affordable Care Act, before the quote-unquote protections of the Affordable Care Act, and they were covered for less than half the price. What did we get for the Affordable Care Act? The percentage of Americans uninsured dropped, or excuse me, the percentage insured went up from 85% to 91%. Now, you know, most of those folks, because the government gave them insurance. Now, I'm not against more people being insured. I certainly want to do that, but I wanted to do it at a reasonable cost. What was the cost of insuring 6% more Americans? The cost of that was the other 85% who already were insured had to pay 107% more. That is absurd. I mean, any fool with common sense could come up with a better plan than that. 85%, to go from 85% to 91%, 6% more people covered, the other 85% have to pay 107% more. That is an absurd deal. So let's talk, you know, what were the words he used? Phony and I can't remember the other words. Malarkey. Obamacare, the ACA, was based on a foundation of phony and malarkey. The entire prospect that it would drive down the cost of health care was obviously wrong from anybody who understood the provisions of the bill. And the result was entirely predictable. The people that I'm hearing back from in my district are, what are we going to do? We can't afford this insurance anymore. When Mr. Pascrell refers to the protections of the required coverages, let me tell you, In my business, my little 20-person law firm, I covered everybody throughout my entire practice, and none of the policies that I ever bought had all those protections in them. So, Mr. Chairman, to say that the actions of the president are the reasons why these premiums have doubled, that's fantasy, because they actually doubled in the years before the president took office. I yield back.
Time has expired.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
Mr. Chairman, may I ask a question of Mr.
No,
Bartlett?
not at this time. Does anyone member wish
May
to
I ask a
strike
question
the
of
last
you?
word? No, Mr. Pascal.
Yes.
I'll ask again. Does any member wish to strike the last word? Are there any amendments?
I move to strike the last word.
Mr. Larson, you recognize to
Mr.
strike the last word.
Pascal to ask a question.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Larson. If it's not, I want to be corrected, Mr. Chairman, if need be. Let me ask you this question. The only people affected by the ACA are those people who are enrolled in the ACA, or does it not affect the entire market on special requirements that were not in existence in other plans? So if the answer is no, it affects a lot of other people besides those few people that you talked about, sir. I'll talk about those few people. But let's say it had nothing else to do but the rest of the market. Is that what you're saying? No, I don't think that's what you're saying. Because people who had regular plans, as whatever you call them, many of those people did not have preconditions that could be responded to. Many of those people were women who had to pay more than men.
Will the gentleman yield?
Excuse me. Now, when I'm finished, you could jump in. I like that back and forth. But let me finish. So many people who are not so-called, quote-unquote, enrolled in the ACA are affected by what we passed, how much the insurance companies have to put in responding to their customers. That changed as well. That goes for everybody. It did not just include those people in the ACA. Would you agree with me, sir?
Where I differ with you in that respect is you said 137 million people with pre-existing conditions would lose their protections. Well, the great bulk of those people were covered before the ACA.
But if you take those conditions away, if you take those prerequisites away,
they were covered.
Those people are going to be affected just like those people who are enrolled in the ACA. That was my point. That was my point. So therefore, that's why you're selling us cheap policies today. You're selling us these policies, and I think some of them are necessary, but it's not the solution. And we agree that the ACA wasn't the total solution. So let's change it together. But no. You had an alternative plan. Ho, ho, yo, ho. There's an echo here. Where is it? You don't have it. So it's a lot of chutzpah to question any of the numbers. I could be reading off the chalkboard, for crying out loud. Now, these numbers I can prove. I can assure you. We're not going to solve this unless we do it together. And unless you join us, we're not going to do it. So therefore, you will have accomplished what you set out to do, to bleed the only plan that's in existence that helps people who didn't have insurance before. You bled it. And now you're stuck with it. So you want to give us these few bills today, and tomorrow you're going to give us a few bills to show people that you're really concerned about their health. That's not the answer, my friend. It is not the answer. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone member wish to strike the last word? Are there any amendments to the amendment in nature substitute? There are no amendments. Questions on the adoption amendment in nature substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion chair, the ayes have it. Amendment in nature substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 6305 as amended to the House of Representatives.
Question is on favorably reporting the bill H.R. 6305 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 6305 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House. A roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Nunez? Mr. Nunez, aye. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska? Mr. Smith, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black? Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Reed?
Aye.
Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Renacci? Mr. Renacci, aye. Ms. Nome? Ms. Nome, aye. Mr. Holding? Mr. Holding, aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri? Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Rice? Mr. Rice, aye. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert, aye. Ms. Walorski? Ms. Walorski, aye. Mr. Curbelo? Mr. Curbelo, aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. LaHood? Mr. LaHood, aye. Dr. Winstrup? Dr. Winstrup, aye. Mr. Neal? Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, aye. Mr. Kind? Mr. Kind, aye. Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley?
No.
Mr. Crowley, no. Dr. Davis? Dr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins, no. Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell, yes. Ms. Del Bene? Ms. Del Bene, no. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu, no. Ms. Jenkins? Chairman Brady? Chairman Brady, aye. Chairman Brady?
Clerk will call the roll. Or, excuse me, report the vote.
26 yeas, 13 nays.
On this vote, the ayes are 26 and noes are 13. The motion is agreed to. H.R. 6305 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, I ask staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. The members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk's supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. Our next order of business, H.R. 6309, to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to allow individuals entitled to Medicare Part A, by reason of being over age 65, to contribute to health savings accounts. I turn to Mr. Paulson, sponsor of the bill, for the purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And today, working seniors who enroll in Medicare Part A to cover their hospital expenses, but also have insurance through their employer for other expenses, are not allowed to contribute to an employer-sponsored health savings account. And aside from the fact that many of those working seniors may have been contributing to an HSA before enrolling in Medicare, those same seniors are doing exactly what needs to be done to put the Medicare Trust Fund on a more secure footing and enable it to last for generations to come. They're practicing consumer-driven health care, and they're using their own health care dollars to pay for health care services and health care products. But when they're told then at the age of 65, they can keep their private employer plan, but they can't have an HSA account and contribute any longer, many seniors would say that's confusing and also frustrating. And so I introduced H.R. 6309, the Allowing Working Seniors to Keep Their Health Savings Accounts Act, to allow working seniors who want to keep contributing to their HSA accounts the ability to do so. Removing restrictions on HSA participation for working seniors on Medicare will help them seek value and help drive prices down because they use medical services more than any other group of Americans. I want to thank the chairman for including this bill in today's markup and would encourage support.
We'll now proceed to consideration. The gentleman yields back. H.R. 6309. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. This time, I offer an amendment in nature substitute, which is distributed in advance along with the green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in nature substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I'll now turn to Tom Bartold, Staff Director for the Joint Committee on Taxation, provide the technical description of the amendment in nature substitute with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. Ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Bartold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee have before them two joint committee documents, JCX 49 and 50, which describe the underlying legislation and the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6309. In short, an individual who's Medicare eligible and enrolls only in Part A, the hospitalization part, under the legislation would be considered to not have health coverage other than that provided by a high deductible health plan, and therefore that individual would remain eligible to make HSA contributions. More generally, the legislation also repeals the provision of present law limiting HSA contributions to zero in the case when an individual is automatically enrolled in Medicare. This legislation would apply to contributions to health savings accounts in months made after December 31st of 2018. That describes my brief, concludes my brief description of this legislation. Happy to answer any questions that the members might have.
Thank you. Are there any questions about the amendment in nature of substitute? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Dr. Davis, you're recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Republicans are using ineffective legislative initiatives as an antidote to show up the damage they've done to the Affordable Care Act. One of these initiatives is the Health Savings Account, HSAs. Generally, they do serve some benefit for a limited number of people, but for the average consumer who is finding challenges to pay health care costs and still have some income left to participate in HSAs is not feasible. HSAs usually benefit individuals and families with high incomes. For many people, they would receive little or no tax benefits. HSAs will not serve as a good substitute for the ACA's cost-sharing reduction subsidies that provide help for lower to moderate income individuals. These legislative initiatives put before this committee is an additional $92 billion more on top of the $2.3 trillion tax cut done earlier this year for the wealthy and major corporations. Time and time again, the Republicans rejected each and every effort to invest in families and communities. The GOP tax cuts expand benefits for the wealthiest corporations and elites, but fail to help working families with child care costs, education costs, retirement savings, or rent. The GOP tax cuts fail to strengthen the economic well-being of non-custodial parents and younger workers, to invest in community jobs, and to ensure responsible corporate investment in employees. Republicans rejected my attempt to modernize the Child Independent Care Tax Credit to address the rising cost of child care so that more working families could get help. The Child Independent Care Tax Credit currently provides very few working families with meaningful help due to the extremely low phase-out level of $15,000 and value of credit. For example, in 2014, although 27% of taxpayers in my congressional district used the Earned Income Tax Credit for low-income working families, only 4% of taxpayers benefited
from the Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit. So the need is great, but the help is little. Yet the Republicans rejected my amendment that would have made the full credit available to most working families by raising the current phase out to $120,000, doubling the benefit and ensuring that lower income families receive the full benefit to help middle-class families. Democrats supported helping working parents provide for their children with quality care so they can work. Republicans rejected helping these families. Republicans rejected my attempt to improve the ability of middle-class families to adopt children. Currently, the adoption tax credit inadvertently creates barriers to permanency for a substantial number of families, especially lower-income families. The GOP tax cuts fail to strengthen the economic well-being of childless and younger workers. We know that approximately 20,000 to 25,000 foster youths between 18 and 21 age out of care annually. All of these categories of individuals need help with health care that they will not receive. And the real deal is expanding HSAs is not going to make up for the damage that has already been done to the Affordable Care Act, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Larson, recognized. Strike the last word. Did you have your hand up earlier? Okay, excuse me. Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Mr. Doggett?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This particular bill seems targeted at those, if I understand it, who have turned 65, are still employed and have an employer health care bill, want to take advantage of Medicare, and now want to be protected on their health care a third way through stashing money in a health savings account. In other words, these are fortunate individuals who are seeking protection in 3 different ways to cover the potential disaster of health care bills. And while I respect the desire to protect some individuals 3 ways, I am also concerned about literally millions of Americans who are protected no way, are protected only by Medicare. I'm concerned about the millions of Americans who turn 65 and have no savings at all. Now, there is a Medicare Rights Center, which has a no-cost, toll-free hotline, and they get inquiries from people all over America concerning Medicare and the challenges that they have. They have received an incredible number of calls concerning prescription price gouging. They have received calls from a significant number of people that note that as important and vital as Medicare is, it fails to cover many services that seniors would like for it to cover. They do not report any calls, however, with reference to someone wanting to get greater access to a health savings account. And so it's strange that of all the many shortcomings, omissions in our healthcare system, that the one that has been selected for action today is to give some people 3 ways of healthcare protection, while others have practically nothing, and to ignore the experience out there that seniors aren't demanding this, though some Republican leaders here in Congress may be doing so. The whole approach of the health savings account fails to address soaring health care cost. Nowhere is this worse than with reference to prescription drugs that have risen, the key, most frequently prescribed ones, 10 times the rate of inflation. It is imperative for this Congress to act, but of course, this committee, like the other committees in this Republican-controlled House, has shown no interest in acting on the issues of prescription drugs. President Trump said that by bidding, as he used the term, by negotiating, we could save $300 billion with reference to the cost of drugs under Medicare, the very kind of cost that some people through this legislation want to protect themselves from. But now President Trump has abandoned that, and he's declared that drug manufacturers are not the problem with their monopoly prices, but it's someone else. And his most recent version of it is it's all a problem with the foreigners, that somehow if they have the ability to negotiate reasonable prices, that if we could force them through our trade agreements to have higher prices, somehow the benefits would trickle down across the globe to people in America and we would pay lower prices. Total nonsense, but still what he is talking about. And of course, today he's been tweeting about the fact that the great benefit of his announcement is that Pfizer, one of the leading price gougers for Americans of all ages, they raised their prices right after President Trump's announcement, but our great success is that on those price increases that they just announced, the second set in a year, they've lowered them to where they were before. And that's all that he can point to as the success under his announcement of all that he was going to do about soaring prescription drug costs. So even for the fortunate few who are able to use this bill, should it be enacted into law, they face the challenge of prescription price gouging. It's just that they will have a little better protection than the millions of Americans who have little or nothing in this regard. Our focus ought to be on containing healthcare costs, particularly prescription drugs, and on providing more accessibility for all seniors, not just those that this bill would cover.
I think the gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Paulson, you recognize to strike the last word.
Well, and Mr. Chairman, just to answer a little bit in rebuttal, just a reminder, this bill is aimed at those working seniors who are actually, turning 65. They're not using all of Medicare's services. They have an employer-sponsored health care plan. If they have a high deductible plan, we should be encouraging actually these folks to stay in the workforce, especially at a time when now we have more job openings than we have job seekers, and a lot of folks want to be able to continue to work. This is simply another choice that will ironically save Medicare money. Save Medicare money because individuals will now be using their own health care dollars to pay for services rather than relying on Medicare or straining that program any further. So again, applying to working seniors, much as health care savings accounts have become more and more popular over the year, where now 22 million Americans essentially have them. Average median income, $57,000. It's probably right on par with where this senior population would be as well. This is not for the wealthy. It's another option and another way to have consumer-driven health care actually lower costs. I would yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Pascal, do you wish to strike the last word?
Chairman, can I ask a question?
The gentleman controls the time.
Thank you. Mr. Barthard, can you please explain the tax treatment for health savings accounts? And do other of the tax-preferred accounts have these same preferences?
Mr. Pascal, for a health savings account, an employer can make contributions to an employee's health savings account,
right,
and such a contribution would be excludable from income of the employee. If the employee makes contributions to his or her own health savings account, the employee may deduct that contribution from their taxable income. In other words, tax-free treatment, whether it's from the employee's received compensation or whether it's paid as part of compensation of the employer. If a distribution is made from a health savings account for qualifying medical expenses, the distribution is not counted as part of income.
Well, as far as I know, 6309, that's what we're discussing, right? 6309, the cost of that bill would be $5.5 billion. Is that correct?
That's the estimate that we report in JCX 50.
I want to know this. How much of the tax benefit accrues to individuals with incomes under $100,000?
I don't have precise figures for you on that, Mr. Pascal. I did promise earlier in the markup that I'd provide an analysis that we had provided to some
That will
staff.
be part of the analysis, sir?
Well, it will give you some indication of that because it will show you employer contributions to health savings accounts and employee deductible contributions to health savings accounts distributed by our normal income classes.
So I mentioned less than 100 million. Incomes over 1 million? And what about incomes over 5 million? And what about incomes over 10 million? Could I see a breakdown of who's benefiting for what?
Partly because the data becomes relatively thin, to use the statistician's jargon, at levels of income over $1 million. We do not report distributions of tax liabilities or benefits at finer gradations than $1 million and over, sir.
Has your staff or the Joint Commission on Taxation analyzed how this bill would improve the quality of health care received by individuals with an HSA? Have you had any kind of an analysis of that?
Quality of care, sir?
Yes, sir.
We've not done I should note on this, we've worked jointly with the analysts in health care at the Congressional Budget Office, and we have not discussed quality issues.
Has your staff at the Joint Committee on Taxation analyzed how this bill would impact pharmaceutical costs?
This specific bill, no, we have not in a specific way. No.
Has the staff at the Joint Committee on Taxation analyzed how this bill will lower the cost of health care services for individuals? It would seem to me that if we're going to, correct me if I'm wrong, if we're going to be moving in this particular direction, which I have some questions about, then we must have some tangible evidence that this is going to lower the cost. Do you have any such?
I will have to check with my colleagues to answer that. I can say in a very general way, this bill is, in effect, is rather small in that it affects a rather small population, which was a point that was made earlier. Overall medical costs are driven by a larger population, larger insurance risks and health risks. So, one small bill is unlikely to have a very measurable effect on overall national.
Well, we're talking about a series of bills here. This bill is $5.5 billion. Each of the other bills are pretty substantial. I would consider the $5.5 billion pretty substantial. Maybe you don't. But in the whole realm of things, it's just another bill.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Sure.
Anyone else wish to strike the last word? Mr. Levin, you're recognized. Or, excuse me, Ms. Delbenny, you'd sought recognition earlier? Okay. Thank you. Mr. Levin, you're recognized. Strike the last word.
Just to be clear, Mr. Bartow, is there a distribution analysis of this specific bill?
My colleagues and I have not prepared a specific distribution analysis of any of the bills. The information that I promised that I'd supply to all the members is from data from 2015 on contributions to health savings accounts by employers, by taxpayers, and participation levels in health flexible spending accounts.
I thought so. So, you think it's feasible to have an income distribution analysis of this bill?
Probably not feasible because, again, populations are small. It's with the data that we have to tie it specifically to individuals enrolling in Medicare Part A. We probably don't have the data to support that. Qualitatively, retirees that are people, they're not retirees, as Mr. Paulson pointed out. People age 65 who remain in the labor force and are covered by employer health insurance tend to be a little bit higher income than the general population. So relative to the general table of overall participation, qualitatively, you might expect that benefits from this would be slightly higher income tilted. But I would only say slightly without having really any hard stats on income of employees in high deductible employer-provided plans who are age 65 and over.
Because the only credible information the majority continues to refer to a document that is not based on governmental analysis. So essentially, you're saying, if you look at the distribution table that you're going to present, it's likely that those who benefit from this will be of even higher income on average than would be true of the table in general. I think that's what you're saying.
That's a fair characterization,
Okay,
Mr. Levin.
I just think it's important that we understand really who the beneficiaries are of the present structure, and it's understandable why there'd be an effort to address some of the problems with HSAs, and that's done in specific bills. But it's important we look at the overall structure here and the effort essentially to expand a structure, HSAs, that benefit primarily better off people, while the Republicans have taken steps to hurt insurance coverage for the vast majority of people who have less income. That's basically what we're doing here today. And so you want to take one piece or another, but when you put all the pieces together, all of them together, essentially what you're doing, you're undermining ACA every way you can, while now you're presenting something that would benefit, according to the figures of Mr. Barthold, 5% of the population. And you can try to put some kind of glean on this, Mr. Chairman, but that's the basic issue here. That's the basic issue here. And that's why I think even if this could pass the floor, and I want to finish, we'll welcome this debate. We'll welcome this debate and the debate about where ACA is now, because the public is more and more understanding the favorability of the steps that we took courageously to begin to expand health care to 20 million, and now you've reduced it to 17. But more and more people are enrolling, and more states are now addressing the advantages of expanded Medicaid. So we'll be glad to take you on the floor.
So will we, Mr. Levin. Mr. Roscom, you will recognize, strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I think it's interesting listening to Mr. Pascrell, because he should really charge for admission, seriously. Listening to him, and all of a sudden, as he was challenging you, Mr. Barthold, did you evaluate this in terms of national cost? You know, he kind of creates this feeling of like, yeah, did you evaluate this in terms of national cost? And then you begin to think, well, it's a pretty ridiculous assertion, actually. Because you can also say, well, did you have a study on how this impacts cancer rates? Did you look at how this has an impact on heart disease? Did you look at how this has an impact on Alzheimer's? And the answer is no, of course not, because that's not what the bill is designed to do. So let's rewind the tape and let's look at what this bill is designed to do. What Mr. Paulson is proposing is to say, We've got a Medicare system that is in dire straits. We can go back and forth in terms of blame game and so forth, but let's stipulate that we've got a Medicare system that from a financial point of view is in dire straits.
No, it is.
He is creating an incentive for people to not access the Medicare system at the same rate that they normally would. And so Mr. Paulson's bill intervenes and says we're going to help people to stay on a different plan. Yeah, we're proposing to expand an HSA to do that, but the benefit to the American taxpayer is fewer people on Medicare. And is there data that says that these people are wealthier or they're higher income? That's true by definition. Why is that true by definition? It's true by definition because they are working. So let's all focus in here. What Mr. Paulson is proposing is a comparably modest remedy that helps Medicare by relieving pressure, by using the tax code to keep people to moving in a direction that keeps them working in the private sector, paying taxes, for goodness sake, and creating a more holistic and beneficial situation. So I don't think that Mr. Bartold can be asked, how does this have an impact on the entire healthcare savings program or healthcare costs writ large across the country, in the same way that he can't be asked about what its impact is on Alzheimer's or cancer or heart disease and so forth. So I think we can really overanalyze, over-engineer, and over-criticize. And frankly, the repetition of criticism is not persuasive. The repetition of criticism is simply repetition. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of substitute? What purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman has an amendment at the desk. Mr. Riker?
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Thank you. Point of order has been reserved. The clerk will distribute the amendment. I ask the gentleman to suspend while the clerk distributes.
Is deaf. He can't even take a compliment. Brilliant amendment. He's hitting this one out of the park.
The gentleman is recognized for purposes of offering the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this simple amendment underscores the debate that we've been having here all afternoon. And while it does nothing in the underlying bill of 6309, and I agree in a large part with what Mr. Paulson is trying to accomplish, as I did in a number of the bills that were being put forward today as it relates to individuals. But the frustration on our side of the aisle is the overall impact that we see on the Medicare program. And so this is Mr. Roscom just spoke about this, but this is a way to compromise and kind of come together around people that are continuing to work in the workforce and contribute. God bless them. But also, you've heard from our side about the vast majority of people that are left out, that are disadvantaged. And most recently, of course, with the enaction of the tax cuts, what we've heard from the reports is how Medicare specifically has been impacted in a very severe manner. In fact, its solvency has been shortened by 3 years. So all this amendment would do is to say is that before this bill goes into effect, that we would restore the Medicare Hospital Trust Fund to its previous standing. So that instead of losing 3 years, we would gain 3 years by this simple approach. Now, we have criticized, and I specifically have criticized my Republican colleagues for not paying for these giant tax cuts. And you've heard it today, and whether it's Mr. Kind or whether it's Mr. Pascrell, Mr. Levin, Mr. Thompson, all of us have been concerned about the fact that these are unpaid for. And I used to think that, geez, you know, my colleagues on the other side, they used to pride themselves on fiscal responsibility until it came to this area where they've been completely negligent. But it turns out I was wrong. They will pay for these devastating cuts to these programs by raising Social Security and Medicare. That's who this is balanced on the backs of. That these proposals, in their 2018 report, the trustees for Medicare and Social Security confirmed that Medicare Hospital Trust Fund has moved 3 years closer to insolvency thanks to the GOP tax law and their agenda, now becoming insolvent in 2026 instead of 2029. And so while we hear all the pleadings of how the bill is going to assist Medicare, it may in some respects. With one hand, you're saying you're going to help it out incrementally and taking away and gouging it with the other hand. Now, who are these trustees who have confirmed that the GOP tax law has damaged Medicare? Well, Secretary Mnuchin, Labor Secretary Acosta, Health and Human Services Secretary Hsas. That's why I'm offering this simple, common sense amendment. Nothing in the underlying bill can go into effect unless the annual trustees report confirms that those years that have been robbed from Medicare are restored. Pretty straightforward, pretty way to do this. And unlike the ACA, which added 12 years to the trust fund, Republicans continue to push an agenda that puts Medicare at risk. You're better than that. You've heard the pleas from this side of the aisle. There is broad agreement for us to work together. Why won't you take us up on that? Yes, the Affordable Care Act was flawed. Yes, it needed to be fixed. And for 8 years, all you did was try to undo it, and with no results. And now to try to cover over with some menial plan, as well-intended and as whomever it may or may not help, does not solve the problem that we face. Why not for once do something for our constituents that helps solve a problem? Why not at least put forward and join us in this amendment and bring Social Security back to the solvency that it had previously under the Affordable Care Act? And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Rice, do you wish to speak on the amendment? Now, at this time, does anyone wish to speak on the amendment? Mr. Kind.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I commend my colleague from Connecticut for offering this amendment. I refer to this amendment as the Hippocratic Oath Amendment, first do no harm. And as Mr. Larson just pointed out, the Medicare trustees report that came out a little over a month ago was written by President Trump's own appointees. These weren't outside people or outside experts. These were people within the administration themselves who, in their report, indicated that based on the policies pursued by this Republican colleague, the solvency of Medicare is rolled back 3 years. A drop in revenue because of the tax cuts, especially those that weren't paid for recently, the elimination of individual responsibility, all a direct result of policy that the majority in Congress is pursuing that's jeopardizing the long-term solvency of Medicare. So what we ought to do is first correct that and get back to some stabilization of that fund again before moving on to other measures. But even on top of that, Mr. Chairman, after passage of the tax cut, it was not that surprising on this side that the first budget resolution that the Republican Party came out with called for $560 billion worth of cuts to the Medicare program. And on top of that, an additional $1.5 trillion cuts to the Medicaid program. Just happens to add up to roughly $2 trillion, which, according to the Congressional Budget Office, is the cost of the unpaid-for tax cut over the next 10 years. You don't have to be a mathematician or a rocket science to connect the dots with all this. We see where the policy is heading, and it's heading in the jeopardy of the solvency of Medicare. So Mr. Larson, in this common sense amendment, is trying to restore the status quo. First, do no harm before we go on to other measures. And that's why I think it's a wise amendment and should be adopted. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone wish to speak on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, Ms. Doggett, you're recognized.
So regarding the future of Medicare, I think the choice is pretty clear. Under the Democratic approach to the Affordable Care Act, the Medicare Trust Fund had its solvency extended by 12 years. That is to ensure that Medicare will be there not only for this generation, but for the future as well. And under the Republican administration, by their own words from their own officials, even though President Trump is known to frequently disavow his own administration officials' comments, but there seems to be unanimity among Trump administration officials that have any participation with reference to Medicare. The Republicans, instead of extending it for 12 years or 5 years or even 3 years, no, they've actually reduced the solvency, the security of the Medicare Trust Fund by 3 years, and at the rate they're going, that's just a starting point. Because as they keep piling on debt on top of debt, the solvency of Medicare is clearly jeopardized. They have always favored some type of privatization of Medicare. First, it was letting it wither on the vine. Then it was moving toward a voucher system where the risk of health care, of disability for seniors would be shifted to the senior, where you would get a certificate to buy insurance, then the value of that security would not rise at even the cost of medical inflation, much less the 10 times inflation that applies to prescription price gouging in this country today. And so this amendment, a modest amendment really, is designed to simply assure the solvency of Medicare and it's a matter of priorities really. It is a question of whether you want to help those who are already being helped a great deal or whether you want to ensure security, Medicare availability in the future, and whether you feel that the best way to assure the future solvency of Medicare is not to keep chipping away at benefits and increasing premiums for seniors, the approach that our Republican colleagues have traditionally taken, if they couldn't privatize Medicare entirely. But instead of shifting more of the burden and the cost to the seniors, to have a Medicare trust fund that is solvent and is secure and that addresses the issue of containing health care costs. So it's a very clear choice. Do we strengthen the solvency of Medicare and its availability for future seniors who need it, who need to be able to retire with dignity, or do we reduce the solvency of Medicare? Enough damage has been done to Medicare already. The desire of our Republican colleagues to weaken it and to undermine Medicaid, a critical partner of Medicare in providing for the long-term care of many seniors already, how that choice is made. And so I fully support the amendment, would urge my colleagues to adopt it, to stop the attacks on Medicare and Medicaid and strengthen the solvency of the Medicare system. We can't undo all the harm that has already been done by our Republican colleagues, but we can at least move in the direction of strengthening the solvency of Medicare, and I applaud the gentleman for his amendment.
Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I make a point of order to the amendment because it is not germane to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. The amendment violates House Rule 16, Clause 7, because it delays the enactment of this bill depending on a contingency unrelated to the underlying bill.
Does the gentleman offering the amendment wish to speak on the point of order? Mr. Larson?
Yes, I do. While I respect the gentleman from Washington State, and I certainly respect the ruling, you know, let's be honest, that's not what this is all about. Mr. Paulson has a reasonable bill. We have reasonable concerns on this side. These concerns aren't being addressed. And if the American people who are listening into this don't get it, then, and I think they do, shame on us. The inability for us to come together on reasonable solutions, including those that would make Medicare solvent to where it previously was, seems to me to be a common sense approach to what we have to do in this committee. I think we all can understand and appreciate the fact that we're going through an election. But even President Trump has said, and he said it, and I give him credit for this amongst 16 other presidential Republican candidates, that he would do no harm to Medicare and Social Security. They apparently haven't read the budget or what will happen with respect to these tax cuts and how they're going to be paid for and what its ultimate impact will be on Medicare and Social Security. And this is what disturbs us to the core. And so while this amendment may be found non-germane, what is germane is what's happening to the American people, what's happening to them in their savings, what's happening to them in their health care system, what's happened over the last 8 years that instead of working to fix the Affordable Care Act, what we've done is let it dwindle and done everything that we can to devastate it instead of working to try to find solutions that will help the American people. We often talk about polling and data and how they view the president. How people view Congress is far below those levels. And you know why? Because we don't work together to come up with solutions. Even when faced with an opportunity to do so, what aggravates the public is they see us retreating to what they perceive to be partisan enclaves. And while there are principles in both of those enclaves that people cling to, what people want to see is us move forward in a way that actually benefits and helps their lives. And so while a few may benefit, and rightfully so, the vast majority who doesn't look on and say, how can they possibly do this? How can our elected officials sit here day after day knowing the problems that we face and just glibly pass over them and nothing gets done or taken up because it's ruled non-germane or never comes to the floor for a vote? And I can talk about a myriad of issues with respect to that, but I think everybody on this committee gets it. I will yield to the gentleman.
Well, I find it really amazing, the fear to permit a vote directly on this, since your amendment's clearly germane. Doesn't this bill allow for people to draw out benefits from Part A and thereby diminish in a small way the solvency of Medicare because people are using their benefits?
That's correct.
And what your amendment does is to, knowing the damage Republicans have already done to the solvency of Medicare, since their bill takes out of Medicare, you're trying to assure the solvency of Medicare for the future, which would appear to me to be directly germane. It seems to me that what's always declared non-germane in this committee are measures that Republicans are fearful to be on record voting on directly, and it's not germane to address the real health care problems that seniors face, but only to deal with those who are fortunate enough to have three-way or two-way protection already, and not those, the millions, the tens of millions of people that lack comprehensive protection and lack the assurance that Medicare will be solvent. So specifically on the germaneness issue, this is a germane amendment. Any fair reading of our rules with reference to germaneness, when you're taking money out of Medicare with your bill, and you offer an approach to try to protect and assure that you don't take any more money out after the damage Republicans have already done to solvency, 3 years right off of the solvency of Medicare, to at least say don't do any more.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Well said.
I am prepared to rule. I will point out, though, that the underlying argument, I think the gentleman offered this amendment in good faith, and I appreciate that, but the underlying arguments are simply untrue and fictional for a very simple reason. The Medicare trustees report admits their estimates occurred on revenue before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was put in place. They used old data before the tax reform bill was in place and didn't recognize, as the Congressional Budget Office did, an additional $1 trillion of more revenue to the federal government after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act than before. Nor does it recognize the additional workers and the higher paychecks whose revenues underlie the foundation of Medicare. The bottom line is, I think we're hearing fear-mongering today because my Democrat friends hate to be reminded they slashed $700 billion from Medicare. And they hate to be reminded as well that every one of my Democrat friends opposed the Medicare Part D prescription drug plan, opposed helping seniors with their prescription costs in Medicare. With that, and by the way, don't take my word for it. Check yourfact.com, checking Steny Hoyer's tweet that the tax plan will trigger cuts to Medicare next year, said that verdict absolutely unsubstantiated. With that, the amendment is not germane to the amendment nature substitute because it violates House Rule 16, Clause 7, delaying the implementation of this bill, depending on a contingency unrelated to the underlying bill. Point of order is sustained. The amendment is not in order.
Court of vote.
Gentlemen, appeal the ruling of the chair?
I do.
Mr. Reichert, do you move to table the appeal? Table the appeal. Questions on the motion to table the appeal of the chair's ruling? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion to table is agreed to. Are there any other amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Seeing none. Questions on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 6309 as amended to the House of Representatives.
Question is on favorably reporting the bill H.R. 6309 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 6309 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House. A roll call is requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Nunes? Mr. Nunes, aye. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska? Mr. Smith, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black? Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Reed? Aye. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Renacci? Mr. Renacci, aye. Ms. Nome? Ms. Nome, aye. Mr. Holding? Mr. Holding, aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri? Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Rice? Mr. Rice, aye. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert, aye. Ms. Walorski? Ms. Walorski? I can't hear you. Ms. Walorski, aye. Mr. Curbelo? Mr. Curbelo, aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. LaHood? Mr. LaHood, aye. Dr. Winstrup? Dr. Winstrup, aye. Mr. Neal? Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? No. Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? No. Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind. Mr. Kind, no. Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley. Mr. Crowley, no. Dr. Davis. Dr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez. Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Higgins, no. Ms. Sewell. Ms. Sewell, no. Ms. Del Bene. Ms. Del Bene, no. Ms. Chu. Ms. Chu, no. Ms. Jenkins. Chairman Brady. Chairman Brady, aye.
We leave this stuff here.
Chairman Brady.
Aye. The clerk will report the vote.
23 yeas and 16.
Members in the audience, committee is still working. Clerk will report the vote.
23 yeas, 16 nays.
On this vote, the ayes are 23, the noes are 16. The motion is agreed to. H.R. 6309 as amended is ordered favorably reported. House of Representatives, without objection, I ask staff be authorized to make technical forming changes to the bill. Members have 2 additional days. File with the committee clerk supplemental, additional dissenting, or minority views. The committee stands in recess until 10 a.m. tomorrow, July 12th.